Welcome back to Benny's Custom Works. Today we're on the ever trusty IS200 again. We recently took it to a wet skid pan and all in all it was pretty good. Had a lot of fun. I'm still a terrible driver, but there was a few things I found a lot different driving this compared to Adam's S13. Notably the suspension is a lot softer and there's a lot less steering lock. So check out the video now and we'll see you guys in a minute. So now that you guys have seen what we found, we've actually got a new set of coilovers to go in today, and we've also got some lower ball joint spacers which will change the roll center. In addition to that, they actually give you more lock. I found them online in Japan. I haven't seen anyone over here using them yet, so it'll be interesting to see A, if they work, and B, if they fit. They look pretty well made, but the thing I've already noticed having a quick look at them this morning is they don't come with an extra set of bolts which are required to fit them. So I've dug around in the BRZ bolt bin of death and we've already found some good OEM bolts that'll work. So without further ado, let's chuck it on the hoist and get into it. Handy little tip right off the bat. It may sound like common sense to some people, but even I've been a victim of this one before. When you're putting coilovers in a car that's not particularly low already, make sure that you put the hoist pads as low as possible, so that when you do take the car off the hoist, it's not actually stuck on the hoist, and you don't have to spend hours like jacking up corners and pulling the arms out one at a time. Super simple, but as I said, even I've been caught out by this before, sort of not having the forethought. So wind the pads as low as possible. The only complication I have seen with winding these all the way down is sometimes you can get caught up on sills or things like that. So be mindful when you're first lifting the car up, just to give a quick visual check to make sure you're not punching the sills in, and should be all good. I know this isn't relevant to everyone because not everyone has a hoist, but as I said, even I've been caught out in a workshop situation before doing this, and it can add like 10 or 20 minutes trying to get the car off the hoist to the job. So handy little tip for guys that do have access to a hoist. Oh, that's right, we already removed all the Lexus from the boot, except for that. Now that we've got the old coilovers out, it's time to open up the new ones, and we'll put them side by side and have a bit of a comparison. We've got our coilovers unpacked. We've now got them next to our old coilovers. A lot of you guys are probably wondering why we didn't actually just put springs on the existing coilovers. There's a few reasons for that. These are primarily a street style coilover. The spring rates are quite soft, and as a result of that, the valving in the shocks will be quite soft. These Neomax Rs are more of a motorsports kind of orientated shock and spring setup. We've gone for much heavier spring rates in these than what these original Petters coilovers had. So if you look at the Petters ones, they actually had a 6 kilo rear spring and a 10 kilo front spring. We've actually gone for a 16 kilo front spring and a 12 kilo rear spring as our setup. These are kind of a pretty good all-round shock, sort of shock and spring combo. Going too soft can mean sort of it floats around, and that was what we were experiencing. Going too heavy is going to mean that it's kind of just going to crash over bumps and still not work properly. So the consensus was that these are a pretty good combo and a bit of a happy medium as far as circuit, skid pan and drifting. We also didn't want to go too light in the front spring rates because we do actually plan on changing that engine out at one point. We're not exactly sure what's going to go in it, but being that most of the 6-cylinder cast iron engines are pretty heavy, we didn't want to go too soft on the front rate because then we're going to have to change springs in the front later. And that's just going to mean buying more stuff down the road. So that's probably also another thing to mention too, is if you are going to sort of build a project car, it's worth doing stuff once rather than doing it 2 or 3 times. So if you've got a kind of a clear direction you want to head in, buy parts to suit where you want to end up at, not where you're at right now. So they're probably a touch too heavy for the 2-litre engine, but in saying that, I'd rather be a touch over and then it work with the final combo than it be too soft and have to sort of adjust or correct stuff later. So another little handy tip, a lot of coilover springs these days have kind of like a 6 or an 8 or a 9-digit part number on them. Generally that includes the spring rate in kilos. The Petters ones, the last 3 digits of the part number or on the fronts we have here are 010, which means it's a 10 kilo spring. Coming over to the Silver's Neomax, got the same deal. The last 3 digits of the part number are also the spring rate. They use 160 as 16 kilo and 120 as a 12 kilo spring. A lot of the other numbers sometimes can either mean the internal diameter of the spring followed by the length in the case of the Petters. The Neomax ones, I'm not exactly sure what they mean. This is the first time I've used these, but I'm sure someone will be able to tell us in the comments. But yeah, handy little tip. The part number, the end of the part number is generally the spring rate. This can be particularly handy with second-hand coilovers. Obviously, if you buy them new, generally you know what spring rates they come with. But in the case of the Petters ones that we had that came out of the car, we had no paperwork with them. So yeah, quick wipe off of the spring and it shows the part number as clear as day. So handy to know if you are either looking at buying second-hand coilovers or if they're in your car that when you buy them, then you can sort of make a more informed judgment if you are going to upgrade to something like this, going from a street package to a track package or a motorsport setup. Then you're not sort of guessing and sort of shooting in the breeze. So handy little tip that should help you guys out a bit when you're looking at coilovers. It's also worth noting that some coilovers, depending on the vehicle, are actually different left to right. It's worth laying all your stuff out and having a good look at it before you start fitting it, just to familiarise yourself with the product. Generally, if they are different left to right, they'll be marked on the coilover itself. This particular car, they're the same left and right, both front and rear. Obviously, the front and rear coilovers are different, but either side can be put either way. There's no particular orientation on these ones because they run the same lower leg. McPherson strut vehicles typically have a left and a right lower leg due to like brake hose brackets and ABS sensor brackets and things like that. But because this is an upper and lower arm configuration, most of that stuff's actually mounted to other parts of the suspension, not the shock itself. So the only thing we have to put on is the ABS sensor brackets, which are pretty simple. They can be slipped on once the coilover's installed. So we'll do those once we've got the top nipped up. We'll go up and we'll put the lower bolts in, and we'll also put our ABS sensors on, and that'll be sweet. One thing to be mindful of on any car that has a front or a rear sway bar, when you're lifting up the hub to meet the coilover, or if you're lifting up the strut top to meet the strut tower, when you're lifting one side, generally that means it's actually lifting both sides at once. So you've got to be really mindful to make sure that both sides are actually aligned at the same time. So in the example of the front, you've got to make sure that your lower mounts are aligned correctly. And in the example of the rear, you've got to make sure that your strut top's orientated correctly. So if you don't get that right, generally it means you're actually going to have to undo the side you've just done to bring it down, and then align both of them correctly and then go back up again. So we've got both of our lower legs aligned correctly, so we're going to lift it up and put both the bolts in at the same time. Great success. No more crusty old IS200 wheels. We've got our car positioned on some low-level ramps. It's actually not to get the car off the hoist, it's just so that it can take the load of the suspension without us having to mucking around, move the arms out and stuff like that, because we are going to go back up again. At this point, we're just looking at the ride height. I'm pretty happy with it anyway. So I'll take a few quick measurements to make sure that it's the same left to right. And if it is the same, we'll just lock all the coilover nuts up and we're pretty much done. And then we're going to move on to our steering lock spacer plate. I don't know exactly what they're called. Everyone calls them different names. So once we lock the coilovers up, we'll throw those in, and then that's pretty much us done for the day. Going to take 4mm out of the left front ride height. We're going to add 4mm to the left rear ride height, and then the car should be pretty much dead flat. So we'll take all the wheels off again, and then we'll tighten up all of our coilover nuts, and we'll be sweet. Now time to put our lock spacer and roll center correction plates in. They look like pretty well a bolt-in setup. I've already noticed 4 of the spacers. I've had to just shorten those a little bit, but nothing too major. So we'll undo these rack ends and continue to fit them. The one thing I find a little bit concerning is it looks like we actually have to cut the factory steering arm off to make those fit, which basically means you can't go back from it. Not great in my opinion, but I guess for 140 bucks or whatever they cost, it's not really that much of an expense, and these steering arms are available everywhere. You can still buy that steering arm and ball joint combo from Toyota, so it's not the end of the world if we have to replace them down the track. And then we'll just cut them again, but should be all right. Another little tip today, to undo the steering knuckle or the steering arm or any like tapered ball joints, anything like that. I see a lot of people sort of put the nut on 4 or 5 threads and then hit the nut down to try and break the taper. Another way, which is a lot easier and also doesn't damage the thread, is to just grab small or medium hammer and just hit the actual steering arm itself. It shocks the taper and it actually basically pushes it apart. So a couple of quick hits and it should drop out. So we'll give it a crack. A few more. There we go. Nice and simple, and it doesn't damage any of the threads. Just got a little bit of a bearing retainer compound just to hold these sleeves in. They're just more or less like a seat fit. They're currently just sort of fall out every time you pick up the arms, so going to put a little bit of this bearing retainer on to hold them into the plate so that if and when we have to pull this apart in the future, they don't all fall out everywhere and be annoying. So nice and simple, nothing crazy, just a little kind of drop on each one of them will mean that we don't have to go chasing them next time we pull it apart, and then potentially if we're at the track not losing one, which won't be fun. Just using a little bit of thread locker on these bolts. They do have lock nuts on them, but because they've been done and undone a couple of times and we don't have new nuts here, I'll just chuck a bit of Loctite on there, and then it'll get us out of trouble. So now we've got our old piece of steering arm, just having a quick look at how much we've actually shortened it. There's a good sort of 10mm at least that it's taken out of that. And it's actually, yeah, it's shortened it up heaps, so that should give us a fair bit more lock. So we'll be doing reverse entries in no time. that's one side all done. It's all in there pretty neatly. Looks pretty good. Yeah, the only thing I wasn't sure about was cutting that arm, but you can see that it works pretty well once it's in there, so it's cool. Added bonus to this plate is it also gives you a bit of a roll center correction. So when you lower a car heaps, basically it means that the roll center moves up a lot. So by running this plate, which I believe is about 10 or 12 millimeters thick, plus the spacers, you're looking at a roll center correction of about 17 millimeters. So then it means now that the arm, even though that the vehicle is very low, the arm's actually below horizontal, which is what you want with suspension setup. So it should make it handle a lot better. That's a lot of lock, Jesus Christ. We've had a little bit of a problem wherein we've run out of rack end, so I've just jumped on the net and ordered some new outer tie rod ends. All the experts in IS200 land swear black and blue that the GS300 rack end is longer and will fix our problem, so fingers crossed they're right. But I guess that brings us to a halt today, so I guess we'll pack it up and we'll come back tomorrow. We're back on the IS200 today. It's day 2 of the steering adventure. The one thing we did need the other day was some extended rack ends. Luckily, SparesBox had some on hand, so we're going to chuck them in and see if we can get a wheel alignment. Got both of our outer tie rod ends here. The black used one obviously is from the IS200. This new silver one is from a JZS 160 or 161 Aristo or GS300. As you can see side by side, there's a fair bit more length on the Aristo GS300 one, which is exactly what we need. So we're going to have plenty of thread engagement with our rack end. This one actually ran out of thread completely before we even got close to having a decent wheel alignment. So unfortunately these aren't going to cut it anymore. But it's good to know that there's a nice, easy off-the-shelf replacement that literally bolts in. The thread's the same on that end and that end, so no hassles with that. So let's whack these in and get it done. Got our outer tie rod ends on. It all looks really good. Obviously there's a ton of toe in at the moment, so we've actually got the opposite problem of what we had before, which in our case is a really good thing. So we're going to go up and give it a rough sort of measurement alignment. I'm just going to measure it with a measuring tape. Obviously it's going to change the second we put it on the ground. The ride height compressing will change the toe in or out. We are just going to get it properly wheel aligned at a shop down the road. Once I get it sorted, I'm going to give them a quick call and see if they're available to do it at the Savo. So we'll chuck it up in the air and do a quick tape measure to get it pretty close, and then we'll get it properly aligned. Now that we've finally got the car on the ground, it's time to set up the dampeners. These particular silvers have 40 points of adjustment. I generally like to set them about half, so we'll go all the way back to soft and then turn them 20 clicks. So that should give us about half. On this particular car, because it's obviously a track car and can't be driven on the street, we'll take it to the track and play around with the settings. But yeah, generally starting from about half, I like to generally sort of start to stiffen the front or soften the back depending on what the car's doing. But yeah, good rule of thumb I find is to start in the middle and then either go softer or firmer rather than all the way soft and then come through the range. So handy little tip that works for me. So nice and easy. Well, that's the next step of the IS200 finish. We've now got our new coilovers in. We've also got our extended lock lower steering arms in, and we've also put extended rack ends in to allow us to actually have some form of wheel alignment. We've also accidentally built a stance car, so Kev will be proud. But nothing but to do than give it a run. So let's go for a drive in the car park because I can't drive it anywhere else. Well, it drives. Nope, doesn't like that. Whatever it's doing, it doesn't like that. You know how people say you can never have your car too low? This is too low, it's horrible. The throttle response is terrible too. Because it's got like that fake e-throttle weird rubbish. Job done. See you on the seesaw. I did promise it would be guard ruiningly low. We'll raise it up.